Today we're going to return to our discussion of Confucius. And last time we were talking about his theory of virtue, the three basic questions of ethics. What should I do? What kind of person should I be? And how should I decide what to do? And we discussed his theory of virtue, virtues as a means between extremes. So today we're going to talk about a very important part of his hypothesis, which is that there are different virtues associated with different human relationships. Am I now too loud? No, okay. Okay, so there are different virtues and different norms, different rules that apply to different kinds of relationships. And so there are three basic categories, as I read Confucius about this. One is the category of other people in general. Acquaintances, strangers, people you happen to encounter with whom you have no particular special relationship. Then there are relationships of family and friends. And finally, the relationship you have to yourself. Those are three different categories, and he says there are different things that apply there, different virtues that are important. In some sense, all of those virtues rest on the virtues of the self. In another sense, they all rest on the virtues of friends and family, because that's where virtue starts. So, let's take a look at the way that this is actually developed in the Analects. Here's the way I like to depict it. Most central, most close to me are the virtues of the self. After all, I relate to myself. You might say throughout most of my life, that's really what I'm doing. After all, a certain amount of time, I'm talking to other people or I'm interacting with others. Sometimes I'm asleep and not really doing anything. But other times, in fact, most of the time, I'm really engaged in a kind of inner dialogue with myself. And so the most important virtues are those I display toward myself. We might say that, look, every moment when I'm just silent and thinking, I am conducting this conversation with myself, and it matters a lot. As Iris Murdoch says, what kind of conversation that is. So those are going to be the most central virtues. But then really our virtues are developed in our interactions with our friends and our family, and so that's a very important set of relationships that are beyond us, not quite as intimate as our relation to ourselves, but nevertheless important, and then the relations we have with other people. So let's take a look at how these are developed. Take a look at the beginning of the Analects. And here it's rather remarkable that the Analects begin in a way that's utterly conversational, utterly everyday. A lot of texts that found world religions start in a big dramatic way. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Or, in the beginning was the Word. Or, gosh, what's another one? The Dhammapada from Buddhism. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. Big dramatic statements. This is the way the Analect starts. The master said, isn't it pleasant to learn and apply what you've learned? Isn't it delightful to have friends coming from far away? Isn't he a person of complete virtue who doesn't get angry that others don't appreciate? Now, by the way, that translation says recognize. I think I translated that in the text as appreciate, because it doesn't mean, who are you? It means doesn't recognize your virtues, doesn't recognize your strengths, doesn't appreciate. Now notice what's going on here. It's not only a sort of everyday, very humanistic beginning, but also, isn't it pleasant to learn and apply what you've learned? Where do you learn? I mean, where does something happen when you learn something? Yeah, it's inside, right? It's internal to you. It's something that happens at the level of the self. What about friends coming from far away? Well, that's a question of that relationship of friends and family. And then somebody else who doesn't appreciate you, who doesn't know you in particular well enough to appreciate you, that person is at that level of others. All throughout the beginning of the Analects, which, by the way, appears to be a more or less disorganized collection of sayings, but I think it's not at all disorganized. This is what really gives a pattern to the opening section of Book 1 of the Analects. It's really a matter of these three levels. The most central level, the one mentioned first there, the level of the self. And we find out something important about it. What's the most important thing going on at the level of the self? Learning, knowledge. The second thing, friends, interaction with friends, that's that second level. And finally, the level of other people, of strangers, of mere acquaintances. Look at how this continues. You said, few filial and fraternal people like to offend their superiors, and nobody who doesn't like to offend superiors likes to stir up rebellion. I've actually put that on logic exams and said what follows from those two premises. Can anybody tell me, by the way, what follows from those two premises? Few filial and fraternal people like to offend their superiors, and nobody who doesn't like to offend superiors likes to stir up rebellion. What follows? Yeah, few filial and fraternal people like to stir up rebellion. Yeah, but if that seems like hard to figure out to you, you should take logic. All right, that's my advertisement for the day. But now we can move along. The most important part of this, from our point of view, is what comes after. The superior person attends to the root of things. The superior person is one who pays attention to what is really fundamental, to what is basic. From the root, from that thing that is basic, grows the way. The way, remember, the Tao, the path, the proper way to live. And now, what is the root here? What is the root of the proper way to live? Answer is these two virtues, filial piety and fraternal submission. Those are the root of benevolence, of virtue, in other words, ren. Now, that tells us something key. There are two fundamental virtues here that are the basis, in some sense, of all others. The basis because they are the things from which we start. We begin by learning how to behave, by interacting with our friends and our family, those who are closest to us. Initially, we were talking about this last time in connection with Shunzi. We're babies and we're concerned just with ourselves, but then it's with ourselves and mama, then other members of our family, and then other people who are close. In short, it's really in that incubator, you might say, of the family and close friends that we learn how to behave, that we learn how to interact, even with ourselves. And so those things are the roots of virtue in general. Well, this pattern of the three levels goes throughout the beginning of the Analects. Here is 1.4. Zeng said, every day I examine myself on 3 points. By the way, there are a number of people with whom Confucius interacts here. Students, some of them acting in effect as TAs. Some of them, other people who happen to encounter Confucius. Zeng is somebody who appears at a variety of points, and there's a tradition in Chinese thought about which of these are more reliable than others. Zeng is not especially reliable, so we shouldn't trust entirely what he says. But notice that what's going on here is, again, in accordance with the three levels. I examine myself on 3 points, whether with others I may have been unfaithful, whether with friends I may have been untrustworthy, whether I may have failed to master and practice the instructions of my teacher. Notice again, we go from others to friends to then the self. And that pattern is one that recurs throughout. Here is 1.7. Zixia says, if someone turns from the love of beauty to a sincere love of virtue, if he can serve his parents with all his strength, if he can serve his prince with his life, if his words to his friends are sincere, although people say he hasn't learned, I will certainly say that he has. So what is involved here? Relationship with parents, in other words, with family members, with friends, with others, in this case, government officials, and then what's at the foundation of all of that? Learning. Learning is what makes all of that possible, and that occurs at the level of the self. Well, there are virtues, then, to be discussed at each level, and also some principles to be discussed at each of these levels. Let's start with virtues toward others. Those are things that apply no matter who you're talking to, so that it will also apply at the level of friends and family and of the self, but they are most characteristic of our relations with other people. Now, we should start with, well, the 5 virtues of Ren that we've already talked about: seriousness, generosity, sincerity, kindness, and the one I always forget. What is it? Diligence. Diligence, thank you. Hard work. I forget hard work. That probably tells you a lot about me. Anyway, as Zikong says, and here's the other thing that has to be added besides the 5 virtues of Ren. Zikong asks, is there one word that serves a rule of practice throughout life? One principle to which everything comes down in your relation to anybody at all? Confucius said it is reciprocity, or altruism, or likening to oneself, or other translations of the Chinese term zhong. What you don't want done to yourself, don't do to others. That is sometimes called the silver rule. It's a close relative of the golden rule, which says, treat others as you would want to be treated. This is the negative version. Don't treat others the way you wouldn't want to be treated. Okay, so it's a little bit weaker than the golden rule. It primarily tells you what not to do. Okay, now what are some things you wouldn't want done to you? Good, murder. You wouldn't want to be murdered, so this is going to apply. Well, then don't murder. Okay, what are some other things you wouldn't want done to you?
Be lied to.
You wouldn't like to?
Be lied. dishonesty.
Be liked?
Be liked.
Oh, okay, yes. Yes. So you shouldn't want to do that sort of thing to others either. In general, if somebody is going to harm you, right, you might think, yeah, look, if I'm going to be harmed, I don't want that, so I shouldn't do that to other people. This is a very powerful rule then for generating all sorts of other principles. What about virtues toward family? We've already seen those are the roots of virtue in general. So, filial piety, obedience, reverence, service to your parents, to your elders. In general, you might say, once we start applying this outside the family, this is a virtue shown in vertical relationships, relationships of authority. So it's a matter of deference to a higher authority, but also it involves the responsibilities of someone in a position of authority, like a parent, toward a child, an employer toward an employee. In general, the person who has authority with respect over whom they have authority. So that is a kind of vertical sort of thing. It's a matter of knowing how to behave toward those above you in the authority ranking and below you in the authority ranking. And then fraternal submission. That's service and trustworthiness to your equals, to your peers, to those on the same level. And so it's something like a horizontal relationship. And what are the kinds of virtues and rules that go along with that? Those virtues are the roots of when, of virtue. And how do we know that? Well, because it's really by being brought up in a certain way that we learn how to behave toward other people in general, and we learn how to behave toward ourselves. So, we first learn how to interact with our parents, with our brothers and sisters, and then we generalize from that to virtues applied to other people. Now, what are some of the most important obligations you would have to your parents, for example?
Taking care of them as they grow older.
Good, taking care of them as they grow older. Yeah. Respecting them. Obedience. What are some main obligations that you might have as a parent toward a child? Feeding them. Good. Taking care of them in general, right? Guiding them, leading them in the right path. So it's important on both of those levels. It's not like it always goes upward. Now Confucius stresses the upward part, partly because he thinks that's the most important, partly because that's the part you learn as a child. That's the real incubator of virtue in general. You learn how to behave toward your parents, and you learn how to behave toward other people older than you, because you're a newborn. So everybody's older than you in a sense. But then, as you develop other sorts of family relationships, you start interacting with people roughly on the same level as you, with friends, with brothers, sisters, cousins, etc. Fraternal submission becomes more important. And then when you become even an older brother or sister, or you become a parent, then the downward obligations become significant as well. Anyway, you learn how to interact with other people by interacting with your family, and if those family relationships are messed up, your conception of virtue is going to be messed up. Okay, so it's very important that the family actually be properly ordered and that these virtues be displayed within the family. If they're not, everything gets into trouble. There's a work called The Great Learning, one of the 4 books of Confucian. It's really just 1 paragraph long. I put it in a textbook I was editing, and it just said, Confucius, The Great Learning. Somebody said, what do you mean from The Great Learning? This is an excerpt. I said, no, this is the whole thing. It's half a page. But essentially what it says is that if you want a well-ordered state, that requires well-ordered communities, that requires well-ordered families, and that ultimately depends on the virtues of the self, and that depends on knowledge. And so if you've got your own head straight, if everybody does, then the families will be well-ordered, and then in turn, the entire country will be well-ordered. Anyway, let's move down to the level of the virtues of the self. What is going on at the level of the self? Those are important virtues too, and in some sense, the most important virtues. Because once you've developed your character, these are the ones that really determine how you interact with everyone else. And so, not only are these the things that are relevant for much of your life in that inner dialogue with yourself, but also these end up being crucial for how you treat everyone. The master said, a scholar who is not serious will not be venerated. His learning will not be solid. Hold faithfulness and sincerity as first principles. Have no friends not equal to yourself. When you have faults, don't be afraid to abandon. Let's look at each of those parts in turn. If you're not serious, then your knowledge is not going to be trustworthy. So the idea in a way is, well, everything depends on knowing things. Knowing what to do, what not to do, but that depends on knowing things about the world, knowing things about other people, knowing things about yourself. And if you don't know those things, if you aren't serious about trying to represent the world and yourself accurately, you're not going to be able to do that. So in the end, it all depends on knowledge, and that depends on seriousness. But in addition to that, faithfulness and sincerity. This is part of the reason that sincerity is considered by many Confucian scholars to be the most fundamental of all the virtues. Now, why is sincerity important? And in particular, what does it mean to be sincere with myself? After all, this is not just a question of how I interact with other people. I've got to be sincere with myself. What does that mean? Yeah?
That if you are lying to yourself, you're not going to be committed to it as much as you are committed to something.
Okay, if I'm not sincere with myself, then my commitments are going to be all messed up. But in addition to that, what else is going to go wrong? I mean, what would it even mean to be insincere with myself? Yeah?
Maybe setting unrealistic, goals and stuff.
Oh, okay, maybe I set unrealistic goals. Maybe I make promises and commitments I cannot keep, or have no intention really of keeping. What else? Yeah, it may be difficult for me to even develop a sense of self and to develop a kind of sort of reasonable conception of myself. Why? Because if I'm insincere with myself, I'm lying to myself, right? I'm deceiving myself in some way. I'm really telling myself something about me and about my future, my commitments, my values, my goals, that isn't right. And that's going to mess me up at many different levels.
I was thinking of acknowledging your own emotions.
Good, knowing your own emotions, right? The person who says, what do you mean angry? I'm not angry. Look, there's a failure of self-knowledge there. And in part, that's a question of that person not being sincere with themselves. Yeah?
If you're insincere with yourself, it causes you to be indecisive.
It can cause you to be indecisive, that's true. It might be that because you're not sincere with yourself, you really don't know what you want, and at some level don't know what your goals are. It could also lead to a kind of decisiveness that's screwed up, where in fact you don't know, but yet you decisively choose to do this. Not because you know yourself and know that's what you want to do or ought to do, but just because, well, it seems like a good idea, people around you are doing it, your parents told you to do it, etc., etc. Yeah?
If you're not sincere with yourself, you won't see your own faults.
Good, if you're not sincere with yourself, you won't see your own faults. This is like that passage from Mencius that we looked at last time. The archer looks and turns to find the cause of error within himself when he misses the target. If you have faults, don't be afraid to abandon them. But you're not going to make any moral progress unless you know what your faults are, unless you know how to improve yourself. You know, you might think, here's a really important ethical principle. I should be, in particular, the best Dan Bonavac I can be. And you should be the best you can be. But how do you know how to become the best you? Well, you've got to know something about yourself and what your faults are, what your strengths are, what weaknesses you need to work on. And you can't do that unless you're sincere with yourself. So it does require a kind of basic honesty about your own self, your strengths, your weaknesses, what kind of person you want to be, what kind of person you are, what it would take to get from here to there. And let me return to her first point about commitments. Notice, if faithfulness and sincerity are the first principles, there is a sense in which sincerity is even more fundamental. So why are you going to be faithful if you're not sincere? And so it's pretty hard to exercise faithfulness or commitment or promise-keeping or anything like that well without being sincere with yourself. Now, what about this part, have no friends not equal to yourself? What is Confucius getting at there? Why should you have no friends not equal to yourself? Yeah? Oh, it's important to have friends who are as committed to you as you are to them. That is true. Yeah?
Friends can be very influential, so if they're not virtuous,
Good. Friends have an influence on you. And if they're not virtuous, they will lead you away from the proper path. So think about it this way. Some people you're around are going to bring out the best in you. Other people you're around are going to bring out the worst in you. Okay? Lots of people are in between. You probably, think for a moment. How do you behave in different contexts with even different friends? Let's see, leave your parents and teachers and things like that out of it for the moment. Just think about different friends. Are you exactly the same toward any friend, or do you change in the way you behave? If you're like me, you change, right? With some friends, I'm constantly joking around. With other friends, I'm not joking around. I sort of take on a different, I don't want to say I take on a different character, but nevertheless, I behave somewhat differently. Different aspects of my character are emphasized in interactions with different sorts of people. Well, if you hang out with people who are going to lead you to emphasize certain traits of your character, that's going to lead you to virtue. And other people are going to lead you to emphasize traits of your character that are going to lead you away from virtue. So he means, really, from a moral point of view, be around people who are going to make you a better person. Be around people who are going to exercise a good influence on you and not a bad influence. Now, at the level of the virtues of the self, Confucius subdivides further. There are 3 different kinds of virtues, even at the level of the self, and then, of course, with respect to family and friends and with respect to others, that's going to follow from this basic division. He says the most basic thing at the level of the self is knowledge, is understanding yourself and understanding the world, understanding other people, understanding your situation. But now, that gives you what? It gives you, he says, virtues of thought. If you know what's going on, if you know yourself, other people, and your circumstances, then you are going to be able to think about things in the right way. You will exercise the virtues of thought. If you're thinking about things the right way, you will exercise the virtues of feeling because you'll feel about things the right way. And if you feel the right way about things, that will lead you to act virtuously. In other words, he's saying, what does it take to do what you want to do? Well, before you act, that in part is going to be based on feelings. It's going to be based on your emotions. And those emotions can lead you in the right direction or the wrong direction. So you're going to do the right thing on the basis of feeling the right way about this situation. And what's going to lead you to feeling the right way about it? Thinking about the right way. What will lead to that? Actually knowing yourself and the situation you're in well enough to know what the proper way to think about it is. And so that's why in the end, it all comes down to knowledge. So he says, the superior person knows the way. Knows, in other words, what the proper way to live is. And this isn't just a matter of knowing rules, like don't treat others as you wouldn't want to be treated, though that's an important part of it. It's a matter of really knowing something much broader than that. Something about what appropriate behavior is in general. And here is a key point. He says, without knowledge, virtues will change into their opposites. We've said that virtues tend to be a mean between extremes, like generosity, a mean between stinginess on the one hand, and then profligacy or indulgence or spoiling people on the other side. Well, how do you know whether something is an act of generosity or whether it's going too far in spoiling something, or whether it's actually rather stingy? You've got to draw those lines in certain places. And how you draw the lines depends on knowledge. You've got to know what is an appropriate level of generosity for this situation. Now that's going to depend not only on the circumstances, but also on your relationship with that person. So, somebody asks you for help in studying for a chemistry exam. How much are you willing to do for that person? Well, if you don't know any chemistry, that's easy, but some subject you know something about. Yeah?
I would say just enough to ensure that you do well yourself.
Just enough to ensure you do well yourself. Aha. If you have no special relationship with that person, that's probably a reasonable thing. Yeah, I'll help you to the extent that it helps me study, but I'm not going to go beyond that and harm my own studying by helping you. And so, with respect to a stranger, that's a perfectly sensible rule. But what if it's your best friend? He says, man, you gotta help me out. The exam is tomorrow and I'm really not ready. Yeah. Ooh, okay, she says, if it was my brother, I'd go so far as writing a paper for him. Ah, yes. Don't admit that to anybody at the level of a D or above. But a lot of people will do things for a brother or sister, a very close friend, they wouldn't do for an acquaintance or just another member of the class they don't particularly know. And so you might say, look, where we draw these lines, what constitutes spoiling and what constitutes generosity, what constitutes generosity or what constitutes stinginess, that depends on your relationship too. So it's not as if those things are just firm and we know exactly, aha, this is where to draw the line. It depends on your relationship with the person. You, of course, are going to be willing to do things for your brothers and sisters, for your parents, later for your children, that you're not willing to do for just strangers. And that's a sign that those boundaries move, and that means we need to know not just universally where they go, it means we have to know a lot about human relationships in the world to know where to put them. Okay, what are some key virtues of thought? We've already identified one, sincerity, a willingness to face things about yourself, and so it amounts to a kind of self-knowledge. Or maybe I should say it's really the virtue that is underlying self-knowledge, avoiding self-deception, but also humility. You should be willing to admit that you aren't perfect, that you've got flaws. Be willing to admit you have faults and try to remedy them, try to rectify them. No matter how good you are at something, you're not perfect at it. There are going to be ways of improving. But if that's true about playing chess, or about archery, or about chemistry, or whatever it is, of course it's true about broader things in life. Nobody's character is perfect. There are always ways of improving. My wife, when she was in business school, had an accounting professor who at the end gave up the student evaluations and said, but I don't care what you say of them, because at my age, I am what I am, and I'm not going to change. So you can yell at me all you want. I actually, even now that I'm kind of the age he was then, I look at that and I'm absolutely amazed. I don't feel like, hey, I do what I do and I'm not interested in learning how to do it better. Of course I'm still interested in learning how to do it better. And I think that's something that it's important to retain. Confucius says, look, this is how you improve. This is how you become a better person. You have to be able to recognize your faults. And then, of course, you have to do something about them. You have to recognize them, avoiding self-deception about them, but be humble enough to say, I can improve, I can get better, and then try to do it. Virtues of feeling, aha. The superior person, he says, not only knows the way, but loves the way. Okay, in other words, not only knows what the right thing to do is, but wants to do it, is eager to do it, responds to an opportunity to be generous, happily. You know, like, will you help me study for the chemistry exam? Oh, man, look, I gotta do some studying on my own, and I really wanted to watch what's on TV tonight, and blah, 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 blah. Oh, I guess I'll do it. Do you know what it is? You know, okay, you can do it that way. But he says, look, if that's the virtuous thing to do, to help, the virtuous person does it happily. Not only knows that's the right thing to do, but enjoys it. Okay, loves to do that, wants to do the right thing. And so there's a difference between the person who grudgingly goes along and does the right thing and the person who happily does it. And he's saying the virtuous person is the one who happily does it. At 15, he said, I had my mind bent on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I knew the decrees of heaven. At 60, my ear obeyed truth. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing what was wrong. And so what Confucius is describing is a lifelong path of trying to figure out the right thing to do. And notice, really, he had his hint. He's trying to learn, then he's pretty confident, he had no doubts. Finally, he felt like he had true knowledge, and then, finally, at 70, he feels that he can follow what his heart desires without doing anything wrong. In other words, now, feeling is aligned with virtue in such a way that he's not in danger of having his thinking and his feelings lead him away. But it takes a long time. It takes a lifetime of devotion, he says, to be able to get to that point. So, yeah, well, that's the same point. I won't go through it. Now, how do we develop it? How do you actually get that virtues of thought, feeling, and action? Partly, we've already seen the answer. It's by being brought up in the right kind of family, having the proper virtues of filial piety and fraternal submission inculcated in you. But to really go beyond that, we need to consider his answer to a number of the basic questions. What should I do? As we've seen, there are three fundamental questions of ethics, and this is the second one that he addresses. What should I do? It's not so simple as to say whatever a superior person or a virtuous person would do. Instead, he says, this is a matter of following the rules of propriety. It's a question of observing traditional social rules. We observe those rules, they develop in us habits, and eventually those habits become virtues. That's feeling of actions. Now, in talking about what is propriety, what is appropriate behavior, in other words, He has in mind something broader than just moral rules. Something broader than just don't harm others if you wouldn't want to be harmed, and things like that. Now, why? Well, there are all sorts of things that define appropriate and inappropriate behavior that go beyond the moral. If somebody murders someone else, that's really bad, right? Morally bad. It's also inappropriate. It's like, what did you do when that friend asked you to help them on the chemistry? I killed him. It would be another thing to say, that seems inappropriate. Right? It's worse than that. But there are lots of aspects of our behavior that are really governed by these rules of propriety. What's appropriate and inappropriate, and that isn't exactly moral. At least not very directly or obviously moral. For example, right now, you're sitting in a classroom, and I'm standing up here as your teacher. We're both behaving according to certain rules of propriety. There's something you expect to happen in a classroom. And I expect students to behave in a certain sort of way. Well, that's not exactly moral, but what would constitute inappropriate behavior from a student, for example? What are some of these norms that we expect you to obey when you come in? By the way, this is why I'm not entirely sure that signature courses are a great idea. Put a bunch of freshmen together, they don't actually know the norms yet of college behavior, and so it's kind of like putting kids in kindergarten. You know, it's like, there's lots you got to deal with. But anyway, this isn't a signature course, so luckily I don't have to deal with that. Yes? Okay, you wouldn't want people shouting out and interrupting all the time. That would be inappropriate classroom behavior. What else would be inappropriate behavior? Yeah?
Like not wearing clothes.
Not wearing clothes, yeah. Maybe you heard it. This was about 10 years ago. There was a guy who went through Berkeley. I mean, it could only be Berkeley, right? Without ever wearing clothes. He was called the naked guy. And he just went naked for his entire 4 years at Berkeley. Luckily, that has not happened here. Please don't decide to be the first. But yeah, you might think, look, that's pretty inappropriate behavior. He did wear sandals. Anyway, what are other forms of behavior you might think are inappropriate in the classroom? Yeah?
Getting on your stage.
Oh, getting up on the stage, yeah. You might say, oh, listen, Professor, I understand Confucius better than you. Step aside here. Let me go over it. That's inappropriate behavior, even if it's true that you know it better. I'm trying to think of some inappropriate forms I've seen. I once taught in a Hebrew day school. Oh my gosh. It was middle school, science and geometry. And there was a kid in the back. Actually, he was one of my favorite students, which gives you an idea of how the rest were. Who used to eat pistachios. He would shell the pistachios, eat them, and then throw the shells away. The students would get to class before me and throw all the chalk out the window. One time, a school football had been left in the stairwell, and so I picked up the football and brought it to class. I was immediately tackled by like 5 middle school guys. These are inappropriate forms of behavior. I very quickly decided I could not teach anybody lower than the college level ever again. But anyway, that's sort of a special, yeah, I mean, there are lots of rules like that. And it's not, I mean, is it immoral to tackle your teacher? Is it immoral to throw pistachio shells or to throw the chalk out the window? Well, maybe, but it's pretty low-level morality, right? We don't sort of read in basic text, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not throw the chalk out the window. But nevertheless, it's inappropriate behavior. And there will be all sorts of inappropriate behavior possible from a teacher as well. Yeah?
Inappropriate and inappropriate behaviors will have a lot to do with culture too.
They do have a lot to do with culture, absolutely right. So there are certain things that are appropriate in one context that seem inappropriate in others. For example, it seems appropriate for me in the United States, as part of my role as teacher, to ask you questions and then for you to answer. In many parts of the world, teachers never do that, and students would not be expected to talk in class. I haven't really traveled very much, and when I've lectured overseas, it's tended to be in either England or in Scandinavia, well, also in Latin America. But I haven't really done the same thing in France or Germany or Japan or some other places that a good friend of mine has visited and lectured in. In fact, now he teaches full-time in France. But that's something that students in those countries do not do. He found it initially very frustrating because he would ask questions and everybody would just stare at him. Okay? And not the kind of staring that's like, we don't know the answer, we'd like to answer, but no, it's kind of like, you're behaving inappropriately. You're asking us a question. That's not cool. You're supposed to speak and we write down what you say. That's the proper role in those countries. So now that's sort of a minor example, but you're absolutely right. What constitutes behavior that is appropriate or inappropriate varies from place to place. And the same thing is true with dress and all sorts of other things. This is appropriate dress, I think, for a professor in the United States, at least in the southern United States, where it's hot, and I'm not going to wear a coat and tie because it's too hot. But actually in Denmark, where I have given talks and visited, this is garish dress. I mean, look at these pants. They're light colored. They're not dark gray or dark blue or black. And in Denmark, for a man to wear anything but extremely dark colors is just weird. I mean, the first day I was there, I was wearing these. I was wearing a white shirt, and because it got cold, it was the only thing I had. I didn't have a sweater, so I put on a bright Kelly green t-shirt with that. Okay? And I was walking through the streets in Odense, and people were looking at me like, what, you just get off a boat from the Bahamas? What's the deal? Everybody there dresses very somberly and considers anything else rather inappropriate to start with. And so that's something that varies a lot from place to place. Dress, manners, all sorts of things vary. And so Confucius would say, you're absolutely right. These aren't universal things you have to know. These are things that require lots of knowledge of your particular surroundings. What's behavior that's appropriate and inappropriate here and now? And it changes a lot. It's changed a lot of your lifetime. Appropriate behavior, appropriate dress, appropriate interactions with teachers in kindergarten is different from what it is at college level. And so even within a culture, it changes a lot over time in different ways. And across cultures, even more so. Well, there is, as we've seen, one rule, reciprocity. What you don't want done to yourself, don't do to others. And so that's another thing that is important for how we do this. We not only require lots of knowledge of how to behave in various situations, but there is that one rule, at least he thinks, that is universal. Across all cultures, across all settings, no matter what age you are and so on, that's an expectation that really is a moral and universal expectation, and not just one that varies with circumstances or setting or environment or culture or something like that. That's the one thing that he thinks is really unchanging. Everything else changes. It's the one thing he thinks has no exceptions. Everything else has exceptions, but this one doesn't. Now, we talked a little bit about this one. Repay kindness with kindness and injury with justice. We don't repay injury with injury, but neither do we repay it with kindness. He says we repay it by seeking justice. Now, all of that is dealing with this question of what propriety is. How do you get it? How do you actually figure out what's appropriate and inappropriate, and how do you get yourself to conform to it? He says, well, you've got to subdue yourself. If you can subdue yourself and return to propriety for even one day, all under heaven will ascribe virtue to it. This is something we will see in Buddhism much later as well. This thought that it's very hard to do. And so the Buddha will say at one point, try for 1 minute to get your thoughts straight. It's going to be super hard. Don't think a negative thought for 1 minute. And if you can do it, try 5 minutes. If you can do that, try 10, and so on. And maybe, after years of effort, you can do it naturally. But it's a very difficult thing. And how do you get there? Don't look at what is contrary to propriety. Don't listen to what is contrary to propriety. Don't speak what is contrary to propriety. Don't make a move that is contrary to propriety. Okay? So, in short, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Sometimes you say, in fact, I could have worn this t-shirt today where there are 3 monkeys doing exactly that. Or I could show you a picture of the Clinton administration from the 90s illustrating these points from Confucius. I keep thinking, how did that happen? Anyway, I don't know the story behind that photograph, but it's perfect. Well, anyway. Okay, let's move on to that final question, how do I decide? His answer is yi, righteousness. How do I make decisions in general? Well, he says, the superior person takes righteousness to be essential. He practices it according to propriety. He brings it forth in humility. He completes it with sincerity. This is indeed a superior person. You might recognize humility and sincerity as those two fundamental virtues of thought at the most basic level of the self. And so I practice this virtue according to society. So in other words, I do the appropriate thing, I do the right thing. I bring it forth moreover from these fundamental virtues of the self. But what is it that I'm doing here? I am acting with yin. Yin is a matter of acting on the basis of the right reasons. Thinking about things in the right way, bringing into consideration the right kinds of consideration. Thinking about what the right thing to do is. That's what makes me a superior person. So, let's imagine that I'm thinking about who ought to be hired for a certain job. Let's say to teach philosophy. Let's suppose what is not at the moment true, that we're looking for a new professor, and I'm thinking, who should we hire? What kinds of considerations might I bring to bear on that? And which ones are good considerations? Which ones are bad considerations? Yeah? Okay, I might think about the person's academic background. And that's something that seems like a good thing to think about, right? We want people who are well prepared. Yeah? Good experience with public speaking. We want somebody who's going to be a good teacher, and so capable of speaking in public. Actually, there have been people that we've interviewed that I, in particular, said, you can't hire this person, because that person can't be put in front of a classroom. For various reasons. There was one person who just had the squishiest handshake I've ever had. Okay? And that was only one weird thing about this guy, but it was weird enough. It was like the scene in Harry Potter where Gilderoy Lockhart resolves his powers in his arms like that, you know? Oh! And the whole conversation with him was like that. And other people were saying, yeah, he's brilliant. And my guy said, yeah, he's creepy and weird. And I interacted with him later, and we were both right. He is brilliant, and he's creepy, and he's weird. And so that was something that seemed to me appropriate. My colleagues, by the way, didn't think so. They sort of thought, look, we're about to hire brilliant philosophers. Who cares whether they can talk to students? I sort of thought, no, this is why we're actually in job. You know, hired to do this here. We're hired to teach. That's an important part of what we're supposed to do, and that involves public speaking. And I mean, it doesn't involve that much handshaking, but that was only one symptom of the underlying problem. What are some other things I might take into account, appropriately or inappropriately? Yeah?
Responsibility.
Responsibility. Good. Is this person going to be responsible? Are they going to actually do the job? Or are they going to be irresponsible, sometimes not show up, not actually do what they're supposed to do, not grade papers? We had one professor who was here as a visitor, and who at the end of term decided that his graduate students' term papers would be graded in the following way. He had a big party with lots of alcohol. As he walked in, he said, here's your cup for beer, here is a paper. You can have all the beer you want, but grade the paper by the time you leave. Most of the papers at the end were ungraded, but also had lots of alcohol still. He has not been invited back. But yeah, that's a good example of irresponsibility, the kind of person you don't want to have. Other things, yeah.
References.
Good references. What other people who have interacted with this person thought of them, and that seems like an appropriate thing. An appropriate thing. What is an inappropriate thing to consider? Yeah.
Race?
Maybe race, yeah. We don't want to discriminate on the basis of race, right? Or what are other things we might discriminate inappropriately with regard to? Yeah.
Sexual orientation.
Sexual orientation, yeah. If I shook a guy's hand and said, oh, I get this gay vibe. That would be a bad way to react. If it makes me think this guy's mentally ill, at least I hope that's not a bad thing to get. But because I think that will affect the way he goes, interacts with people in the classroom. But something like sexual orientation, no, that wouldn't be an appropriate thing. Yeah.
Like whether you like it or not.
Whether I like the person or not. Yeah. In fact, we had somebody here for many years who said, look, all this stuff about trying to hire somebody who will be a great philosopher and a superb teacher and so on, all that's nonsense. Here's what it comes down to. They all have PhDs, they're all qualified, they can all do okay. So just figure out who you'd like to interview and hire them. That seems to me a terrible way of going about making a decision. It's not a question of who I'd like to be friends with or who I'd like to have a beer with. It's a question of who's going to do the job best. Other things that might be inappropriate. Yeah? Good, physical appearance. Actually, there was a recent study that showed that students learn more from attractive teachers than unattractive teachers. So you guys are going to do great. But nevertheless, in general, if I said, look, this person's a lot better looking than that person, so we should hire that person. That would seem like an inappropriate way to make the decision. So there are lots of things that would be appropriate or inappropriate here. This is a question of what ought to motivate me, what I should be thinking about in terms of a reason. The superior person acts on the basis of the right reasons, takes the right things into account, and in particular doesn't desire or doesn't include their own desires, their own self-interest in the decision. If I just say, gee, who will interact best with me? Who will I like to talk to best? That would not be an appropriate way to do it. I've got to think of who's best for the job, for the whole thing, not just who would be best for me in particular. So don't think about just what's in it for you. Think about what is best for everyone. Think about what's the right thing to do. Think about what is right for its own sake. So the superior person's mind is conversant with righteousness. The superior person isn't for or against anything. He follows what is right. The superior person thinks of virtue. The small person thinks of conduct. The superior person thinks of the law, the moral law in particular. The small person thinks of favors. Next time, we'll look at Aristotle's theory, which you'll see is very